I just want my blood gold back." The Alpha King laughed. Until he read the sealed pack ledger. The wind cut through the narrow streets of Boston like a blade, carrying with it the salt of the harbor and the promise of another bitter winter. Eleanor Ashford pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she navigated the crowded marketplace, her boots clicking against the cobblestones with practiced precision. The year was 1765, and the colonies were restless, but Eleanor's concerns were far more immediate than politics or rebellion. She had come to collect what was rightfully hers, the inheritance her father had left behind, the gold he'd earned through decades of fur trading with the Northern Territories. Blood gold, they called it, because every coin had been purchased with sweat, sacrifice, and the dangerous journeys into territories where few merchants dared to venture. Her father, Thomas Ashford, had been one of the most successful traders in New England, and when he died 3 months prior, Eleanor assumed his wealth would pass to her, his only child. The marketplace bustled with activity despite the cold. Fishmongers called out their catches, their voices competing with the bleating of sheep being driven to slaughter. Women in heavy cloaks examined fabric, while their servants carried baskets of winter vegetables. Somewhere a blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil, steady as a heartbeat. Eleanor moved through it all with single-minded purpose, her destination clear in her mind, even as her heart hammered with anxiety about what was to come. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything. Now, back to Eleanor's journey. She hadn't counted on Richard Blackwood. Blackwood was what the townsfolk called the Alpha King of Boston's merchant class, a man whose influence stretched from the docks to the governor's mansion, whose word could make or break a business, whose wealth seemed to multiply even as others struggled. He was broad-shouldered and commanding, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they touched. When Eleanor's father had fallen ill the previous summer, Blackwood had been there, offering assistance, promising to help manage the trading company until Thomas recovered. Thomas never recovered. The illness had taken him slowly, consuming him from the inside like a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Eleanor had watched her father fade, his once robust frame becoming skeletal, his voice that used to boom across trading floors reduced to whispers. But even in his final days, even when the laudanum made his thoughts fuzzy and disconnected, he'd been clear about one thing. "The sealed ledger," he'd gasped, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "Eleanor, you must find it. Everything is recorded there, every transaction, every payment, every ounce of gold. Blackwood thinks I didn't notice, thinks I was too trusting. But I documented everything. The ledger is sealed, witnessed by Magistrate Whitmore. It's your only protection." She'd pressed him for more details. Where was it kept? How could she access it? But he'd slipped into unconsciousness then, and when he woke again hours later, his mind was elsewhere, trapped in memories of his youth. He died 2 days later, leaving Eleanor alone in a world that had little patience for unmarried women trying to navigate men's business. Now Eleanor stood outside Blackwood's counting house, a 3-story brick building that dominated the corner of State Street. Through the windows, she could see clerks hunched over ledgers, their quills scratching endlessly. Gas lamps flickered against the gathering darkness. It was nearly 4 o'clock, and winter days were short. Somewhere in that building was her father's gold, and she intended to claim it. She pushed through the heavy oak door, and immediately the warmth of the interior embraced her. A young clerk looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from curiosity to something like pity when he recognized her. He couldn't have been more than 20, with ink stains on his fingers and the hunched shoulders of someone who spent his days copying numbers. "Miss Ashford," he said, standing quickly. "I'm afraid Mr. Blackwood is—" "I know he's here," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I saw him arrive an hour ago, Tell him I'm not leaving until he sees me." The clerk hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and dealing with a determined woman who showed no signs of backing down. Finally, he disappeared up a narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing in the high-ceilinged space. Eleanor waited, studying the maps on the walls. Territorial boundaries, shipping routes, trading posts marked with pins. Her father's work was scattered across these maps, his legacy reduced to coordinates and commerce. The counting house smelled of paper and ink, of coal smoke from the stoves that heated each floor, of the wool and leather worn by the men who conducted business here. It was a masculine space, designed to intimidate and impress, with dark wood paneling and stern portraits of previous merchant princes staring down from the walls. Eleanor had been here before, as a child accompanying her father, but then she'd been invisible, just another daughter waiting patiently while the men conducted their important affairs. Now she was here in her own right, and the difference felt monumental. When Blackwood finally descended, he wore the expression of a man thoroughly amused. He was dressed in a fine wool coat, his cravat perfectly tied, every inch the successful merchant. Behind him came two other men, associates no doubt, there to witness whatever humiliation he had planned for her. One was thin and hawk-faced, the other round and red-cheeked, both watching her with undisguised curiosity. "Eleanor," Blackwood said, his voice rich and patronizing. "Still chasing ghosts, I see. This is the third time you've come here in as many weeks. I'm beginning to think you enjoy these visits, though I can't imagine why." "I'm chasing what's mine," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My father's share of the trading company, the gold from the northern contracts, the payment from the Hudson Bay territories that was due in August, the proceeds from the furs sold in September. Shall I continue?" Blackwood laughed, a sound that filled the room and made the clerks look away in embarrassment. It was the kind of laugh that said he found her adorable in her ignorance, like a child insisting that shadows were monsters. "Your father's share? My dear girl, your father died owing this company more than he owned. The expeditions he funded in his final year were disasters. The contracts went unfulfilled. 3 entire shipments lost to storms and theft. I've been generous enough to settle his debts from my own pocket, rather than pursuing legal action against his estate." "That's a lie," Eleanor said, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "My father kept meticulous records. Every contract, every payment, every ounce of gold. It was all documented. He told me about the successful northern run in July, about the exceptional quality of the pelts that season, about the premium prices you negotiated with the Boston buyers." "Did he?" Blackwood's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "And did he also tell you about the expedition that never returned? About the trading post that was abandoned? About the Mohawk tribe that refused to honor their agreements? Your father was a good man, Eleanor, but in his final months, his judgment was impaired. The illness affected his mind as much as his body. He saw successes where there were failures, profits where there were losses." The hawk-faced man behind Blackwood nodded sagely, as if confirming some great wisdom. The round one simply stared at Eleanor with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell. "Then where are these miraculous records?" Blackwood spread his hands wide, the gesture theatrical. "If you have proof, present it. Until then, I suggest you accept reality and move on with your life. Perhaps find a husband who can support you, since your father clearly failed to prepare you for the world. I know several merchants with sons who might overlook your circumstances." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to choke on. Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks. Not embarrassment, but anger. This was exactly what she'd expected, but expecting it didn't make it easier to endure. She'd spent the last 3 months being told to accept her lot, to be grateful that she wasn't destitute, to understand that women couldn't manage complex business affairs. She'd also spent those 3 months preparing for this moment. "I want to see the company ledger," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the clerks who were pretending not to listen. "The sealed one. The one my father told me about before he died." The transformation in the room was instantaneous. The amusement drained from Blackwood's face, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. The hawk-faced man stiffened, and the round one's complexion went from red to pale in the span of a heartbeat. Even the clerks stopped pretending to work, their quills frozen above their papers. "I don't know what you're talking about," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost its confident boom. It was quieter now, more controlled, like a man trying very hard not to reveal something important. "Yes, you do. My father said there was a secondary ledger, sealed and witnessed by a magistrate, that recorded every true transaction of the company. He said it was kept separate from the regular books, protection against exactly this kind of theft. He established it 5 years ago, when you first became partners, as a safeguard. Every major transaction recorded by both parties, verified by witnesses, sealed by legal authority." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed to fade, as though the entire building was holding its breath. Blackwood's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Eleanor saw past the facade of the successful merchant to something rawer underneath. Calculation, perhaps, or fear, or the fury of a man whose careful plans were unraveling. "You're making wild accusations," he said quietly, but the threat in his voice was unmistakable. "Be very careful. Miss Ashford. There are consequences to slander, to making baseless claims against respected businessmen. Your father may have enjoyed a certain reputation, but that doesn't give you the right to damage mine." "I'm not making accusations," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "I'm simply requesting to see a document that legally belongs to my father's estate. If such a ledger exists and shows that his accounts were in order, then we can settle this matter quickly. If it doesn't exist..." She let the implication hang in the air. "Well, then I'll have to wonder why my father was so insistent about it in his final days." "The fevered ramblings of a dying man," the hawk-faced man interjected. "Surely you can't take that seriously." "Can't I?" Eleanor turned her attention to him. "And you are." "Samuel Thornton," the man said stiffly. "Mr. Blackwood's business partner and legal advisor." "Then as a legal advisor, Mr. Thornton, you should know that witnessed and sealed documents supersede regular business records in any court proceeding. If my father was concerned enough to establish such a document, and if Mr. Blackwood agreed to maintain it, then it exists. The only question is whether you'll show it to me voluntarily or whether I'll need to pursue legal channels." Thornton glanced at Blackwood, some unspoken communication passing between them. The round man shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "I just want my blood gold back," Eleanor said, her voice softer now but no less determined. "Nothing more, nothing less. Show me the sealed ledger, and if I'm wrong, if my father truly died in debt to this company, I'll leave and never speak of this again. But if I'm right..." She let the implication hang in the air. "If I'm right, then you return what's owed to my father's estate and we part ways. No scandal. No court proceedings, no public examination of your business practices." Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he threw his head back and laughed again, though this time it sounded forced, performative, like an actor who'd forgotten his lines but was trying to stay in character. "You think you can threaten me? You, a woman alone with no family, no connections, no power? Even if such a ledger existed, what makes you think anyone would let you see it? What makes you think you could do anything with the information?" Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, the moment when everything could collapse or crystallize. She reached into her satchel slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone could see her movements. She withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age but bearing an official seal, the colonial government's mark, unmistakable even in the lamplight. "This," she said, holding it up so everyone could see, "is a letter from my father to the colonial governor, written 2 weeks before his death. In it, he details his concerns about irregularities in his business partnership with you. He requested that upon his death, the sealed ledger be examined by an independent magistrate to ensure his daughter received her proper inheritance." She paused, letting that sink in. "I've already delivered a copy to Governor Bernard's office. They're expecting a response from you within the week." The transformation in Blackwood was immediate and profound. The color drained from his face, his confident stance faltering. His hands, which had been gesturing so expressively moments before, now hung at his sides like dead weights. Thornton's hawk-like features tightened into something resembling panic, while the round man actually took a step backward, as though physical distance might protect him from what was coming. "You're bluffing," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost all its certainty. It came out as barely more than a whisper, the words of a man watching his world crumble. "Am I?" Eleanor tucked the letter back into her satchel with deliberate care. "I suppose we'll find out when the magistrate arrives. Governor Bernard was quite interested in my father's concerns, particularly given the current political climate. The Crown is looking very closely at colonial business practices these days, especially among the larger trading companies. Something about ensuring proper tax collection and preventing fraud. I'm sure an investigation into your books would be fascinating reading for the royal auditors." The mention of royal auditors was a calculated risk. With tensions rising between the colonies and Britain, with new taxes and regulations being imposed seemingly every month, the last thing any merchant wanted was official scrutiny from London. It could tie up business for months, expose every questionable transaction, and potentially result in severe penalties. Thornton moved closer to Blackwood, whispering urgently in his ear. Eleanor couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. Thornton was advising caution, perhaps even surrender. The round man had actually begun edging toward the door, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with tension. Several clerks had abandoned any pretense of working and were watching openly now, aware that they were witnessing something significant. One elderly clerk in the corner had a slight smile on his face, as though he'd been waiting for someone to challenge Blackwood for years. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, Blackwood turned to one of his associates and said through clenched teeth, "Get it." The round man, whose name Eleanor still didn't know, looked relieved to have an excuse to leave. He hurried up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and quick. The wait that followed was excruciating. Eleanor focused on keeping her breathing steady, on maintaining the appearance of calm confidence, even though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. She'd gambled everything on this confrontation. Her father's reputation, her own safety, the truth of what he'd told her on his deathbed. If the ledger didn't exist, if her father's fevered words had been nothing more than the delusions of a dying man, she would be humiliated beyond recovery. Worse, she would have made a powerful enemy for nothing. Blackwood would ensure she never conducted business in Boston again, would spread rumors about her instability, would make her name synonymous with foolish presumption. But if the ledger did exist... The round man returned, breathing heavily from the stairs, carrying a leather-bound volume that looked older and more substantial than the regular account books. Its cover was dusty, its edges sealed with multiple layers of red wax, bearing what appeared to be official stamps. Blackwood took it reluctantly, staring at it as though it were a snake coiled to strike. "This ledger," he said slowly, each word carefully measured, "is a private business document. Even if you see it, it won't change anything. The legal reality is complicated. There are debts and obligations that go beyond simple accounting. Your father's estate." "Open it," Eleanor interrupted. "Let's see what the legal reality actually is." For a moment, she thought he might refuse, might try one more bluff, might claim that the seals could only be broken in the presence of a magistrate. But the presence of the other clerks, the witnesses, the knowledge that Governor Bernard's office was now involved, it had backed him into a corner. With deliberate slowness, like a man approaching his own execution, Blackwood broke the seals one by one. The wax cracked and fell away, revealing the leather binding underneath. He opened the ledger, and Eleanor leaned closer to examine it. The pages were covered in her father's familiar handwriting, each entry meticulously detailed in the precise script she remembered from childhood. She'd watched him work on documents like this countless times, had seen him labor over accounts by candlelight, ensuring every number was correct, every transaction properly recorded. Contract amounts were listed in pounds sterling, with corresponding dates and witness signatures. Gold weights were recorded in troy ounces, cross-referenced with delivery receipts. Payment confirmations bore the marks of multiple parties, her father's signature, Blackwood's signature, and in many cases, the marks of the tribal leaders or trading post managers who had been party to the transactions. As Eleanor scanned the entries, she saw immediately what had happened. The regular company books, the ones Blackwood had been maintaining, showed payments to her father that were significantly less than what the sealed ledger recorded he was actually owed. Small discrepancies at first, just a few pounds here and there, easy to explain away as accounting errors or confusion about exchange rates, but growing larger over time, more systematic, more deliberate. In the first year of the partnership, the difference was perhaps £200, significant but not devastating. By the second year, it had grown to 500. By the third year, nearly 1,000. And in the final 2 years of her father's life, when illness had likely made it harder for him to track the details himself, the discrepancy had exploded. By Eleanor's quick calculation, the difference was staggering. Nearly £4,000 of gold that should have been paid to Thomas Ashford, but had somehow found its way into other pockets. £4,000. Enough to purchase a small fleet of ships, or a substantial estate, or to live in comfort for decades. "This is forgery," Blackwood said desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. His face had gone from pale to gray, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the winter cold. "Anyone could have created this. Your father could have written these entries himself, inflating the amounts. With a magistrate's seal?" Eleanor pointed to the official marks on several pages, the witnessed signatures that appeared at regular intervals throughout the ledger. This was inspected and certified by Magistrate Whitmore himself every 6 months. I'm sure he'll be happy to testify to its authenticity. Shall we summon him now? His office is only 3 blocks from here. Thornton had moved to look at the ledger himself, his hawk-like features becoming more pinched with each page he examined. Whatever he saw there clearly confirmed Eleanor's claims. He stepped back, distancing himself physically from Blackwood, and Eleanor noticed the calculation in his eyes. He was already thinking about how to protect himself from the fallout. The elderly clerk in the corner had abandoned all pretense of discretion and was openly smiling now. Several younger clerks were whispering to each other, their voices rising in excitement. Word of this would spread through the merchant community within hours, Eleanor realized. By tomorrow morning, every trading house in Boston would know that Richard Blackwood had been caught falsifying accounts. "What do you want?" Blackwood asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, his commanding presence evaporating like morning fog. Eleanor straightened, feeling the full weight of this moment. She thought about her father, about the trust he'd placed in Blackwood, about the slow realization that must have come as he lay dying, that his partner, his friend, had been systematically robbing him. She thought about what kind of man would steal from someone who was dying, who would exploit illness and trust for personal gain. "I already told you," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "My father's blood gold, £4,000 as recorded in that ledger, paid in full, with a signed acknowledgement of the debt. And you'll dissolve your claim to any ongoing share of his trading routes or contracts. Everything he built reverts to his estate, which means to me. That's impossible, Blackwood said, and now there was genuine desperation in his voice. I don't have 4,000 pounds in gold just sitting in a vault. That amount of capital is invested, tied up in ongoing ventures, committed to contracts that won't pay out for months. Then you have 1 week to acquire it, Eleanor replied, her tone allowing no room for negotiation. Sell assets, call in debts, mortgage properties. I don't care how you do it. 1 week, or I take this ledger and my father's letter directly to the magistrate, and we let the courts decide. And Mr. Blackwood. She paused, making sure he was looking directly at her, making sure every person in the room heard what came next. I think we both know that once the courts start examining your books, they're going to find far more interesting discrepancies than just what you owe my father's estate. The threat landed like a physical blow. Blackwood actually stumbled backward, catching himself on the edge of his desk, because Eleanor was right, and everyone in the room knew it. If one partnership had been compromised, if one set of books had been manipulated, then all of his dealings would come under scrutiny. Every contract, every payment, every transaction would be examined by hostile eyes looking for fraud. The hawk-faced Thornton was already edging toward the door, clearly eager to be anywhere else. The round man had actually left, disappearing back up the stairs as though he could escape by simply not being present. Several clerks were frantically making notes, perhaps documenting what they'd witnessed, perhaps preparing their own defenses for when the inevitable investigation began. You're making a powerful enemy, Blackwood said, but it sounded more like a plea than a threat. The Alpha King of Boston's merchants had been reduced to begging, and the transformation was almost pitiful to witness. No, Eleanor corrected him, her voice firm but not cruel. I'm collecting a debt. There's a difference. My father trusted you. He brought you into a successful business, shared his knowledge and connections, treated you as a partner and friend. You repaid that trust by stealing from him while he was dying. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Blackwood. You created this situation yourself. She held out her hand. The ledger stays with me. Consider it insurance that you'll honor our agreement. For a long moment, Blackwood held the leather volume, his knuckles white around its spine. She could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to find some way out of the trap he'd built for himself. But there was no escape. The ledger was witnessed, sealed, legally unassailable. Her father's letter to the governor created an official record of suspicion. Any attempt to deny or fight would only make things worse. Finally, with a gesture that looked like it physically pained him, he handed the ledger to Eleanor. The weight of it in her hands felt like vindication, like justice, like her father's final gift to her from beyond the grave. She tucked it carefully into her satchel, making sure it was secure. 1 week, she repeated, then turned and walked toward the door. Every step felt surreal, as though she were moving through water, but she kept her head high and her pace steady. The clerks parted before her like water before a ship's prow, some looking at her with respect, others with fear, all of them understanding that they'd witnessed something significant. Only when she reached the street, when the cold air hit her face, and she heard the door close behind her, did she allow herself to take a shaking breath. Her legs were trembling, her hands unsteady, her heart racing as though she'd run a mile. She'd done it. She'd faced down the Alpha King of Boston's merchants, and won. But as Eleanor hurried through the darkening streets toward the boarding house where she was staying, she knew this was only the beginning. Men like Richard Blackwood didn't surrender easily, and a week was plenty of time for him to plot his revenge. She would need to be careful, watchful, prepared for whatever came next. The boarding house was a modest establishment on Purchase Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Crowley, who asked few questions and charged reasonable rates. Eleanor's room was small but clean, with a window overlooking the harbor and a sturdy lock on the door. She'd hidden the ledger beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, not the most sophisticated hiding place, but better than leaving it in plain sight. That night, Eleanor barely slept. Every creak of the building made her jump. Every sound from the street outside seemed potentially threatening. She kept her father's old pistol on the nightstand, loaded and ready, though she'd never fired it at anything more threatening than a practice target. The wind howled off the harbor, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hours. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke with a start to gray morning light filtering through the curtains. Her back ached from tension, and her mouth was dry. For a moment, she wondered if the previous day had been a dream. But no. The ledger was still there beneath the floorboards, solid and real and damning. The next morning brought snow, fat flakes that muffled the sounds of the city and turned Boston into something from a painting. Eleanor woke early, retrieved the sealed ledger from its hiding place, and spent the dawn hours reviewing its contents by candlelight. Every page confirmed what she'd suspected. Her father had been systematically cheated, his trust exploited, his hard-earned fortune stolen piece by piece. But the ledger revealed something else, something she hadn't noticed in her initial examination at Blackwood's counting house. There were other names in the margins, notes in her father's handwriting that referenced other merchants whose accounts showed similar discrepancies. It seemed her father had been keeping track not just of his own dealings but of a pattern he'd observed. Blackwood wasn't just stealing from one partner. He'd been running a sophisticated scheme involving multiple traders, all of whom believed they were in honest partnerships. One entry, dated nearly 2 years before her father's death, read, "Spoke with Harrison about Hudson Bay receipts. His numbers don't match mine. Blackwood providing different figures to each partner." Another, from 6 months later. "Carmichael complaining of lost shipments. Same routes I use successfully. Suspicious." Eleanor closed the ledger thoughtfully. This information made it even more valuable, and more dangerous. If Blackwood realized that the ledger implicated others, that it could bring down an entire network of corruption, he might become desperate. Desperate men were unpredictable, capable of actions they wouldn't normally consider. She needed allies, people who could help protect her and the evidence she'd uncovered. But who could she trust? Most of Boston's legal establishment had connections to Blackwood, or depended on merchants like him for their livelihoods. The magistrates, the judges, the prominent attorneys, they were all part of the same interconnected web of commerce and influence. Her first stop was the law office of Jonathan Pierce, a young attorney who had handled some of her father's early contracts. Pierce was in his early 30s, earnest and idealistic in a way that made the older merchants dismiss him as naive, but Eleanor had always respected his integrity. She'd seen him turn down lucrative cases because he disagreed with the moral principles involved. Had watched him defend smaller merchants against predatory contracts, even when it cost him wealthier clients. His office was above a print shop on Hanover Street, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked alarmingly with each step. When Eleanor knocked, Pierce himself answered. He apparently couldn't afford a clerk yet, and his face registered surprise and concern when he saw her. "Miss Ashford," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "I heard about your father. I'm so very sorry. Thomas was a good man, one of the few in this business who understood that honor matters more than profit." "He was," Eleanor agreed, looking around the modest office. It was cluttered with books and papers, with a single window providing light and a small stove providing inadequate heat. A half-eaten breakfast sat on the corner of his desk, suggesting Pierce had been working through the meal. "And he was cheated by a bad one. That's why I'm here." She laid out everything. The confrontation with Blackwood, the sealed ledger, the week-long deadline, the implications she'd discovered about other merchants. Pierce listened intently, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, absently running his hand through his dark hair. "This is dangerous," he said finally, his voice serious. "Blackwood has connections throughout the colony. Judges, magistrates, even some members of the governor's council. If he decides to fight this in court, he can drag it out for years, bankrupt you with legal fees, destroy your reputation before any trial even begins. He won't, Eleanor interrupted. Not if it means exposing himself. But I need your help to make sure everything is legally sound. I need documentation that will hold up under any scrutiny, witnesses who can testify to the ledger's authenticity, protection in case he tries to claim it's fraudulent. Pierce nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the legal complexities. I can do that, but Eleanor, you need to understand. Even if you win this, even if you get your father's gold back, Blackwood will find ways to retaliate. He might spread rumors, damage your reputation, make it impossible for you to conduct business in Boston. Men have long memories when it comes to humiliation. Is £4,000 worth that risk? Eleanor thought about her father, about the months he'd spent growing weaker while Blackwood had visited, playing the concerned partner while systematically dismantling everything Thomas Ashford had built. She thought about the other names in the ledger, the other families who might be facing the same theft. She thought about what kind of world she wanted to live in, one where men like Blackwood could operate with impunity, or one where courage and truth still mattered. This isn't just about the gold, she said quietly. It's about justice. My father spent his entire life building something honest, something he could be proud of. I won't let Blackwood erase that. And if I can stop him from doing this to others, if I can expose this pattern of theft. She met Pierce's eyes. Then yes, it's worth the risk. Pierce studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He stood and extended his hand. Then let's make sure you're protected. I'll start drawing up the documentation today. We'll need sworn statements from anyone who witnessed the confrontation, copies of the ledger authenticated by multiple sources, and a clear legal framework for the settlement. Give me 2 days. Eleanor shook his hand, feeling some of the tension in her shoulders ease. She wasn't alone in this anymore. There's one more thing, she said. The ledger suggests there are other victims. Other merchants who might have been cheated the same way my father was. If we could find them, if they could come forward, it would strengthen your case enormously, Pierce finished. And it would make it much harder for Blackwood to claim this was an isolated misunderstanding. But it's also risky. Approaching other merchants means more people know what you're doing, more chances for word to get back to Blackwood before the week is up. I know, Eleanor said. But if we can document a pattern, prove this wasn't just one mistake but a systematic fraud, isn't that worth the risk? Pierce considered this, then nodded. I'll be discreet. I know some of the merchants your father mentioned. Harrison, Carmichael, a few others. Let me make some quiet inquiries, see if they're willing to talk. In the meantime, you should vary your routine, stay alert, and for God's sake, don't go anywhere alone after dark. Over the following days, Eleanor moved through Boston with careful purpose, gathering the pieces she needed while trying not to attract attention. She visited Magistrate Whitmore, the official who had witnessed and sealed the ledger years ago, finding him in his chambers at the courthouse. He was an elderly man, severe in appearance but with kind eyes, and he remembered her father well. Thomas Ashford was meticulous, Whitmore said, examining the ledger she'd brought. I sealed this myself, witnessed every entry. He told me at the time that he had concerns about his partnership, wanted protection. I advised him to dissolve the arrangement, but he said Blackwood had too much invested, that it would ruin the company. Thomas was always thinking about others, even when perhaps he should have been thinking about himself. Will you provide written testimony about the ledger's authenticity? Eleanor asked. Whitmore nodded slowly. I will. And Miss Ashford? Be careful. I've seen many cases over the years, and men like Blackwood don't surrender gracefully. He'll look for ways to discredit you, to make you seem unreliable or emotional. Document everything. Keep copies of all papers in multiple locations, and make sure people know where you are at all times. She took his advice seriously, creating multiple copies of key sections of the ledger, storing them with Pierce, with Mrs. Crowley at the boarding house, and with a banker she'd known since childhood. She wrote detailed accounts of her confrontation with Blackwood, had them witnessed and dated, and distributed those as well. She also began making discreet inquiries among her father's old trading partners, the men who had known and respected Thomas Ashford. She found them at their warehouses and offices, in taverns and coffee houses, anywhere she could arrange quiet conversations away from prying eyes. She was careful in her approach, never directly accusing Blackwood, just asking questions about their own business dealings, about whether they'd noticed any irregularities in payments or accounts. Most were reluctant to talk at first, wary of getting involved in what could become a messy legal battle. But Eleanor had inherited more than her father's business sense. She'd inherited his way with people, his ability to make them trust him. She listened more than she spoke, asked gentle questions, and gradually, stories began to emerge. James Harrison, who traded in lumber from the northern forests, admitted that his payments from joint ventures with Blackwood never quite matched his own calculations. "I always assumed I was making mistakes in the accounting," he said, looking embarrassed. "But now that you mention it, the discrepancies always favored Blackwood. Always." Robert Carmichael, who ran shipping routes to the Caribbean, had similar tales of missing inventory and payments that came up short. "I lost 3 shipments in as many years," he said. "Blackwood assured me it was pirates or storms, and I believed him. But your father ran the same routes without problems. Made me wonder if those shipments were actually lost, or if they just went somewhere else." Each conversation revealed another piece of the pattern. Blackwood had been careful, never stealing so much that it would trigger immediate suspicion, always having plausible explanations ready, always managing the books in ways that made it difficult to prove fraud. But the cumulative effect, spread across multiple partners and years, had been enormous. By the 4th day, Eleanor had gathered statements from 5 different merchants, all documenting similar experiences, all willing to testify if necessary. It was more than enough to establish a pattern, to prove that her father's case wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger scheme. But gathering this evidence had consequences. Word was spreading through the merchant community that Eleanor Ashford was making inquiries, that she'd confronted Blackwood, that she had some kind of damaging document. People were talking, speculating, choosing sides. Some merchants who did business with Blackwood were circling their wagons, closing ranks against what they saw as an attack on one of their own. Others were watching with interest, perhaps hoping that Blackwood's fall might create opportunities for them. On the 5th day after her confrontation, Eleanor received her first direct threat. It came in the form of a note slipped under her door at the boarding house, unsigned but clear in its intent. "Drop this matter before you get hurt. Women who meddle in men's business often meet unfortunate accidents." Eleanor showed it to Pierce, who immediately insisted she move to a different location. "They know where you're staying," he said grimly. "That's too much of a risk." She relocated to a smaller boarding house near the docks, run by a stern Irish widow named Mrs. O'Brien, who was built like a longshoreman and kept a cudgel behind the front desk. "Any trouble from anyone, miss?" Mrs. O'Brien said, "and they'll answer to me. This is a respectable house." The snow continued to fall throughout the week, blanketing Boston in white and making the streets treacherous. Eleanor watched from her new window as carts struggled through the slush, as merchants hurried between buildings with their heads down against the wind. Somewhere out there, Blackwood was scrambling to raise 4,000 pounds in gold, his empire teetering on the edge of exposure. She wondered if he would actually pay, or if he would try something more desperate. The note suggested he was at least considering violence, though whether he would actually follow through remained to be seen. Men like Blackwood preferred to work through legal channels and social pressure, but when those options disappeared, they sometimes resorted to cruder methods. Eleanor kept her father's pistol loaded and close at hand. She varied her routes through the city, never leaving the boarding house at the same time twice, always watching for anyone following her. Pierce had arranged for a young law clerk to escort her when she needed to go out, a serious boy named Thomas, who took his duty with admirable gravity. On the 6th day, Jonathan Pierce came to her with news. "I've finished all the documentation," he said, spreading papers across the small table in her room. Sworn statements from Magistrate Whitmore, authenticated copies of the ledger, testimonies from Harrison, Carmichael, and the others. If Blackwood tries to fight this, we have an ironclad case. But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. What? Even if he pays, even if this ends peacefully, your life in Boston is going to change. You've challenged one of the most powerful men in the colony, and people will remember that. Some will respect you for it. Others will see you as dangerous, unpredictable, someone who breaks the unspoken rules about how business is conducted. You'll face obstacles you wouldn't have faced otherwise. Eleanor had been expecting this, but hearing it stated so directly still sent a chill through her. "I know," she said quietly. "But the alternative was to let him get away with it, to betray everything my father built. I couldn't do that." Pierce nodded, his expression grave but not unsympathetic. "I just wanted to make sure you were prepared. Tomorrow is the deadline. We'll see if Blackwood honors the agreement, or if this becomes something messier." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of the boarding house. Mrs. O'Brien's heavy tread on the stairs, other tenants moving about, the distant noise of the docks where work continued around the clock. She thought about her father, about the life he'd built through honest work and careful planning, about the legacy he'd tried to leave her. She thought about Blackwood, too, trying to imagine what he was feeling. Anger, certainly. Humiliation at being bested by a woman he'd dismissed as inconsequential. Fear of what else might be exposed if the investigation went forward. But perhaps also relief that she'd offered him a way out, a chance to settle things quietly, rather than face public exposure and legal consequences. The 7th day dawned clear and bitterly cold. Eleanor dressed carefully, her best dress, presentable but not ostentatious, her father's ring on her finger as a reminder of why she was doing this. She tucked the original ledger into her satchel, along with all the authenticated copies and documented testimonies Pierce had prepared. Pierce met her at the boarding house, accompanied by Thomas the law clerk and, unexpectedly, James Harrison. "I wanted to be here," Harrison explained, "to witness this, to make sure it ends properly. Thomas was my friend. I owe him that much." Together they walked through the frozen streets toward Blackwood's counting house. The journey felt longer than usual, each step laden with significance. Pedestrians hurried past, wrapped in heavy cloaks and scarves, their breath steaming in the cold air. Shop signs creaked in the wind. Somewhere a horse whinnied, unhappy with the weather. When they arrived at the counting house, they found Blackwood waiting with his hawk-faced advisor Thornton and 2 other men Eleanor didn't recognize. The room was tense, silent, except for the ticking of a large clock on the wall. No clerks were present this time. Blackwood had clearly sent them away, wanting no witnesses to whatever was about to happen. On Blackwood's desk were canvas bags, their seams bulging with weight. "Count it," Blackwood said without preamble. His voice was flat, exhausted, stripped of its usual commanding tone. He looked like he'd aged a decade in a week, his face haggard, his clothes less immaculate than usual. £4,000 in gold as you demanded. Eleanor approached the desk cautiously, Pierce and Harrison flanking her like guards. She untied one of the bags and looked inside. Gold coins, just as promised, catching the winter light streaming through the windows. The sight of them was almost overwhelming. This was her father's blood gold, the fortune he'd earned through years of dangerous work, finally returned to where it belonged. She didn't count each individual coin. That would have taken hours and would have required trusting Blackwood's scales. Instead, Pierce had brought a jeweler's glass and a testing stone, tools for verifying the authenticity of gold. They checked several coins from different bags, confirming they were genuine, properly weighted, legal tender. "Where's the documentation?" Eleanor asked when she was satisfied. Blackwood slid multiple papers across the desk. There was a formal acknowledgement of debt, stating that the gold represented full payment of all amounts owed to the estate of Thomas Ashford. There was a signed release relinquishing any claims to Ashford's trading contracts or routes. There was even a statement declaring that the partnership between Thomas Ashford and Richard Blackwood was officially dissolved, with no further obligations on either side. Pierce examined each document carefully, his legal training evident in the way he checked every clause, every word, looking for hidden traps or ambiguous language. Finally, he nodded to Eleanor. "It's legitimate, everything you asked for." Eleanor pulled out one of the authenticated copies of the ledger, not the original, which she would never give up, but a complete reproduction verified by Magistrate Whitmore and multiple witnesses. She placed it on the desk alongside a signed statement. "This copy of the sealed ledger remains in your possession," she said formally, her voice carrying despite the tremor she felt inside. "As long as you honor this agreement, as long as you never speak of my father's business or my family again, it stays sealed. If you break the agreement, if you try to retaliate against me or interfere with my father's trading routes, multiple copies will be delivered to the magistrate, the governor, and the colonial courts. Do you understand?" Blackwood stared at the ledger like it was a coiled snake. "And the original?" "Is somewhere safe," Eleanor replied. "Insurance. A reminder that there are consequences for theft and fraud." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was that damned clock, ticking away the seconds. Then Blackwood pulled out a quill and signed the documents Pierce had brought. His hand shook slightly, betraying the rage he was clearly suppressing. Eleanor watched as he pressed his seal into wax, making it official, irrevocable. Pierce gathered the signed documents, verified the seals, then nodded to Eleanor. "We're done here." Eleanor wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the significance of this moment, but no words seemed adequate. Instead, she simply nodded to Harrison and Pierce, and together, they began loading the bags of gold into the cart they'd brought. 4,000 pounds. It took all three of them to manage the weight. "Eleanor." Blackwood's voice stopped her as she reached the door. She turned back to find him standing, his expression unreadable. "You've won. You've gotten your blood gold back, humiliated me, threatened everything I've built. I hope you understand what you've done." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor said quietly. "My father earned that gold honestly. Every ounce of it was purchased with his sweat, his risk, his years of hard work. You stole it, and you would have gotten away with it if he hadn't been clever enough to keep a sealed record. This isn't a victory, Mr. Blackwood. It's justice. There's a difference." "Justice," Blackwood repeated, the word bitter in his mouth. "You think you're so righteous, so noble. But you've just made yourself a target. Every merchant in Boston will know what you've done, will know that you're willing to expose secrets, to break unspoken agreements. You'll find that honesty isn't always rewarded in business, Miss Ashford. Sometimes it just makes you vulnerable." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged, "but I'd rather be vulnerable and honest than successful and corrupt. My father taught me that. I'm sorry you never learned the same lesson." She left before he could respond, descending the stairs with Pierce and Harrison following close behind. The cart was heavy, the gold weighing it down so much that the wheels creaked against the cobblestones. But Eleanor felt lighter than she had in months, as though a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. They transported the gold directly to the Bank of Boston, where Pierce had made arrangements for secure storage. The bank manager, a portly man named Silas Pemberton, counted the gold himself, while a clerk recorded every coin. It took nearly 2 hours, but when it was done, Eleanor held a signed receipt for £4,000 sterling, deposited in an account bearing her name. £4,000. Enough to live comfortably for years, to invest in new ventures, to build something of her own. But more than the gold itself, she'd recovered something even more valuable: her father's honor, proof that he hadn't failed or been foolish, that his trust had been violated rather than misplaced. "What will you do now?" Harrison asked as they stood outside the bank in the fading afternoon light. Eleanor looked up at the sky, at the smoke rising from countless chimneys, at the city that had tried to swallow her whole but had instead given her a victory. "I'm going to continue my father's work. The trading routes, the northern contracts, they're still valuable, and I'm going to do it the way he did, honestly and fairly. Maybe I can prove that it's possible to succeed without cheating people." "You'll face challenges," Harrison warned, echoing what Pierce had said days earlier. "Being a woman in this business, especially after what you've done to Blackwood, it won't be easy." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I've already done the hardest part. I faced down the Alpha King of Boston and won. Everything else seems manageable by comparison." Pierce smiled at that, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in days. "If you need legal counsel, if anyone tries to interfere with your business or challenge your claims, you know where to find me." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and meant it. "For everything." As they parted ways, Eleanor walked back toward her boarding house through streets that were growing dark. Lamplighters were making their rounds, gas lamps flickering to life one by one, pushing back the winter darkness. She kept one hand in her satchel, touching the remaining copy of the ledger, feeling its solid weight. She'd done it. Against all odds, against the expectations of a society that told women to be quiet and accept their lot. Against the power and influence of one of Boston's most successful merchants, she'd won. But as she reached the boarding house and climbed the stairs to her room, Eleanor knew this was really just the beginning. Victory in one battle didn't mean the war was over. Blackwood's warning echoed in her mind. She'd made herself a target, marked herself as someone willing to break the unspoken rules, to challenge the established order. In the weeks that followed, the reality of that warning became clear. Word of her confrontation with Blackwood had spread through Boston's merchant community like wildfire. Some men praised her courage, quietly, privately, never where it might get back to Blackwood's allies. Others shunned her, made it clear that they wanted nothing to do with a woman who would expose a partner's misdeeds so publicly. Several of her father's old trading partners approached her carefully, interested in joint ventures, but wary of being associated with someone so controversial. Eleanor negotiated with them patiently, learning as she went, making mistakes but never repeating them. She discovered she had a talent for the work, an instinct for which deals were solid and which were traps, which partners could be trusted, and which were looking to exploit her inexperience. She hired a small staff, clerks who were meticulous with records, a warehouse manager who was honest, a ship captain named Daniel Murphy, who had sailed with her father for years, and who knew the northern routes as well as anyone alive. She paid them fairly, treated them with respect, and made it clear that she valued integrity above profit. "Your father would have done the same," Murphy told her as they reviewed manifests in her small office above a warehouse. "Thomas always said that trust was worth more than gold, that a good reputation was the real foundation of wealth. You're carrying on his legacy properly." Eleanor also established systems to prevent what had happened to her father from happening to her. Every major transaction was documented in multiple ledgers, with copies kept in different locations. She maintained relationships with independent magistrates who could verify her accounts. She insisted on clear contracts, written agreements, and transparent record-keeping in all her dealings. "You're obsessive about documentation," one merchant complained during a negotiation. "My father was robbed because someone tampered with records," Eleanor replied calmly. I won't make the same mistake. If that level of transparency makes you uncomfortable, perhaps we're not the right partners." The merchant had signed the contract. Blackwood, meanwhile, seemed to contract and withdraw. His once dominant position in the merchant community weakened as partners quietly pulled away, suspicious of his practices after rumors began circulating. Eleanor never confirmed or denied anything when asked about what had happened between them, but her silence was eloquent enough. The sealed ledger remained locked away, a sword hanging over Blackwood's head that could fall at any moment if he violated their agreement. Within 6 months, several of Blackwood's largest partners had dissolved their arrangements with him. Within a year, he'd been forced to sell his counting house and consolidate his operations. Within 2 years, he'd left Boston entirely, relocating to New York, where his reputation hadn't yet been tarnished. Eleanor heard about his departure through the merchant gossip network that kept Boston's business community connected. She felt no particular triumph at the news, just a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. Blackwood hadn't been destroyed. He still had resources, still had connections. But he'd been checked, his corruption exposed enough to limit his ability to prey on others. The other merchants mentioned in her father's ledger, Harrison, Carmichael, and the rest, had also benefited from Eleanor's investigation. Once the pattern became clear, they'd been able to review their own records more carefully, identify discrepancies, and in some cases recover portions of what they'd lost. None had pursued legal action. The evidence was old, the accounting complex, but they'd all severed their ties with Blackwood and become more vigilant about protecting themselves. Harrison became one of Eleanor's strongest allies and most reliable partners. "Your father saved my business without even knowing it," he told her over dinner one evening, nearly a year after the confrontation. "If you hadn't uncovered that ledger, I'd still be losing money to Blackwood, thinking it was my own incompetence. Instead, I've restructured everything, and my profits have doubled." As Eleanor's business grew, so did her confidence and expertise. She negotiated a major contract with a tribe of Abenaki traders in Maine, establishing a relationship that provided exclusive access to prime beaver pelts. She expanded into coastal shipping, running profitable routes between Boston and the southern colonies. She even invested in a small whaling operation, diversifying her holdings in ways her father had never attempted. But success brought its own challenges. Other merchants who had initially dismissed her as a temporary anomaly began to see her as genuine competition. Some tried to undercut her prices. Others spread rumors about her business practices. A few attempted to poach her employees or interfere with her contracts. Eleanor handled each challenge as it came, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through legal action, occasionally through the simple expedient of being better at business than her competitors. She learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of Boston's merchant community, to understand which battles were worth fighting and which were better avoided. One particularly difficult situation arose when a prominent merchant named Cornelius Bradford tried to block her access to warehouse space at the harbor. Bradford controlled several key properties and had made it clear he didn't approve of women conducting independent business. When Eleanor's current warehouse lease came up for renewal, Bradford bought the building and informed her she had 30 days to vacate. Eleanor could have fought him in court. She had the resources now. But instead, she approached the problem strategically. She researched Bradford's business holdings and discovered he had significant debts to several creditors. She quietly purchased those debts, consolidated them, and then requested a meeting. "You want me out of the warehouse," she said when they met in his office. "I understand that, but I wonder if you've considered the timing. Your debts to Morrison & Sons, to the Providence Trading Company, to the Bank of Massachusetts, they all come due within the next 3 months. That's nearly £8,000 you'll need to produce in a very short time." Bradford's face darkened. "Those are private business matters." "Not anymore," Eleanor interrupted, placing documents on his desk. "I own those debts now, all of them. And I'm willing to restructure the payment schedule, give you 2 full years to settle them at favorable interest rates. In exchange, you extend my warehouse lease for 5 years at current rates and stop interfering with my business operations." Bradford stared at the documents, his jaw working. "You're blackmailing me." "I'm offering you a business arrangement," Eleanor corrected. "The debts are legitimate, the terms I'm proposing are generous, and the alternative is that I call them all due immediately, which would likely force you into bankruptcy." "This isn't personal, Mr. Bradford. It's simply business conducted the way men have always conducted it." He'd signed the agreement, though the look he gave her suggested he'd remember the humiliation. But Eleanor was past caring about making enemies among men who would have crushed her without a second thought if their positions had been reversed. The years passed, marked by harsh winters and brief summers, by ships departing and returning, by ledgers filling with careful entries that documented every transaction. Eleanor turned 25, then 30, her reputation growing from controversial curiosity to established merchant. The boarding house gave way to a modest townhouse, then to a larger residence on Beacon Hill with room for an office and space to entertain business associates. She never married, despite occasional pressure from well-meaning friends and relatives. Several men had proposed over the years, some genuinely interested, others clearly more interested in her fortune than herself. She'd declined them all politely, but firmly. Her life was full enough without adding a husband who would legally control her assets and likely try to limit her business activities. "Don't you want a family?" her cousin Margaret asked during one visit. "I have a family," Eleanor replied. "My employees depend on me. The sailors who crew my ships, the clerks who manage my accounts, the traders I partner with, they're all part of something I've built. That's enough." But there were moments, late at night when the house was quiet, when Eleanor felt the weight of solitude. She would sit in her father's old chair, recovered from storage and given pride of place in her study, and wonder what he would think of what she'd accomplished. Would he be proud? Would he approve of the way she'd fought for his legacy? Would he understand the choices she'd made, the enemies she'd accumulated, the unconventional path she'd taken? She liked to think he would. 5 years after the confrontation with Blackwood, Eleanor stood on the docks watching one of her ships, the Thomas Ashford, named in her father's honor, prepare to depart for the Northern Territories. It was a fine vessel, 3-masted and swift, carrying trade goods worth nearly 2,000 pounds. The captain was young but capable, handpicked by Murphy, before the old sailor had retired to a comfortable cottage Eleanor had helped him purchase. The wind off the harbor was cold, carrying that same salt smell she remembered from the day she'd first confronted Blackwood. But now, instead of feeling like it might cut her down, it felt bracing, invigorating, full of possibility. A voice behind her made her turn. Miss Ashford. It was a young woman, perhaps 20, dressed in mourning black, and carrying herself with the same determined posture Eleanor recognized from her own mirror. "My name is Catherine Morrison. My father died 3 months ago, and I believe his partner has been cheating me out of my inheritance. I was told you might be able to help." Eleanor studied the young woman, seeing in her face the same mixture of grief and determination she'd felt all those years ago. "What makes you think you've been cheated?" "My father kept careful records. He told me before he died that something wasn't right, that the numbers didn't match. His partner, a man named William Sutton, claims my father died in debt, but I don't believe it. I have some documents, but I don't know what they mean or how to use them." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a sense of recognition and purpose. "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9, she said. "Bring everything you have, documents, letters, anything your father left behind. We'll review it together." Catherine's face flooded with relief and gratitude. "Thank you. I didn't know where else to turn. Everyone says women can't handle business matters, that I should just accept what Mr. Sutton tells me, but you know in your heart that something's wrong," Eleanor finished. "Trust that instinct. It's often more reliable than what people tell you is proper or reasonable." As Catherine hurried away, Eleanor turned back to watch the Thomas Ashford catch the wind and begin its journey north. The ship moved with grace and purpose, carrying forward the legacy her father had built, the business she'd fought to reclaim and expand. She thought about Blackwood, about the day he'd laughed at her demand for the blood gold. He'd been so certain of his power, so confident that a young woman could never challenge him successfully. But he'd been wrong, undone by his own arrogance and her father's meticulous record-keeping. The sealed ledger remained in her safe, a reminder of everything that had happened. She visited it occasionally, running her fingers over her father's careful handwriting, remembering the man who had taught her that integrity mattered, that careful documentation could be its own form of power, that standing up for what was right was always worth the cost. Over the following decade, Eleanor Ashford became one of Boston's most successful merchants, known for her fair dealing and her willingness to help other women navigate the complex world of business and inheritance. She took on Catherine Morrison's case and helped her recover nearly £3,000 from the fraudulent partner. She assisted a widow named Sarah Chen, whose husband's partners tried to force her out of a profitable tea importing business. She mentored dozens of young women who found themselves thrust into commercial matters by circumstance or choice. Some called her eccentric, others called her dangerous, but no one could deny her success. Her ships sailed to the Caribbean, to Europe, to the Northern Territories and back. Her warehouses stored goods from across the known world. Her accounts showed steady profits year after year, built on honest dealing and careful management. The political situation in the colonies grew increasingly tense as the years passed. Tensions with Britain escalated. Protests turned into riots, and eventually revolution came. Eleanor navigated these changes carefully, maintaining her business relationships while supporting the colonial cause. She provided supplies to the Continental Army, extended credit to Patriot merchants, and used her ships to transport messages and materials when official channels were compromised. When the war finally ended and a new nation emerged, Eleanor found herself in her early 40s, still unmarried, still focused on business, still driven by the principles her father had instilled in her. She'd accumulated significant wealth, but more importantly, she'd built a reputation for integrity that opened doors and created opportunities. She thought sometimes about writing her story down, about documenting what had happened with Blackwood, and how she'd reclaimed her father's blood gold. But she decided against it. The real story wasn't in one dramatic confrontation or one legal victory. It was in the years of patient work that followed, in the relationships built on trust, in the example she'd set for other women trying to find their way in a world designed to exclude them. One spring afternoon, when Eleanor was 45 and her hair was beginning to show threads of silver, she received an unexpected visitor. The maid announced that a Mr. Richard Blackwood was requesting to see her. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. They'd had no contact in 2 decades, and she had no desire to reopen old wounds. But curiosity won out. She received him in her study, where the sealed ledger still rested in its safe, where her father's chair still occupied pride of place. Blackwood had aged dramatically. He was in his 70s now, his hair completely white, his once imposing frame stooped and diminished. But his eyes were still sharp, still calculating, still the eyes of a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with age. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mr. Blackwood, I admit I'm surprised. I thought we'd said everything that needed saying 20 years ago." He settled into the chair she offered, moving slowly and carefully. "I'm dying," he said without preamble. "Cancer, the doctors say. I have perhaps 3 months, maybe less. I wanted to. I needed to speak with you before the end." Eleanor waited, saying nothing. "I've thought about what happened between us many times over the years," Blackwood continued. "About the sealed ledger, about your father, about everything I did. And I wanted you to know." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I wanted you to know that you were right, about all of it." "I know I was right," Eleanor said quietly. "I didn't need you to confirm it." "No, I suppose you didn't." but perhaps I needed to say it. He looked around the study, taking in the evidence of her success. The maps on the walls, the ledgers on the shelves, the quality of the furnishings. You've done well. Better than I ever did in the ways that matter. Your father would be proud. He would be proud that I stood up to a thief and recovered what was rightfully mine, Eleanor agreed. Is that why you came here? To salve your conscience before you die? Blackwood shook his head slowly. I came to apologize. Not because I expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but because you deserve to hear it. I stole from your father. I exploited his trust and his illness. I tried to cheat you out of your inheritance. Everything you accused me of was true, and worse. There were others, dozens of others over the years, all people who trusted me. He looked directly at her. I'm sorry. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. This shadow of the man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable. She felt no satisfaction in his decline, no pleasure in his apology. Just a quiet acknowledgement that time had rendered its own judgment. I appreciate the apology, she said finally, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't undo the harm you caused, doesn't restore what you took from others who weren't as fortunate as I was. My father left me the means to fight back. That sealed ledger, his letter to the governor. Most of your victims didn't have that protection. I know, Blackwood said. That's something I'll have to answer for. If there's any accounting beyond this life, I expect I'll pay dearly. He started to rise, then paused. One more thing. I wanted you to know that after you exposed me, after I left Boston, I tried to do better. Not perfectly, not consistently, but I tried. You showed me that there were consequences to corruption, that someone was willing to stand up and fight. It changed something in me. I'm glad, Eleanor said, and meant it. Even a small change is better than none. After Blackwood left, Eleanor sat alone in her study for a long time, thinking about the strange arc of their story. She'd gotten her blood gold back, had built something substantial and lasting from it, had proven that integrity could compete with corruption and win. But the cost had been real. The enemies she'd made, the conventional life she'd sacrificed, the years of fighting battles that men in her position never had to face. Would she do it again, knowing everything that would follow? Without hesitation? Yes. Because the alternative, accepting Blackwood's theft, allowing her father's legacy to be erased, living with the knowledge that she'd surrendered without fighting, would have been worse than any difficulty she'd actually faced. Eleanor Ashford lived another 15 years, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 60. By then, she'd become something of a legend in Boston's business community. The woman who had challenged the Alpha King and won, who had built an empire on principles rather than exploitation, who had helped dozens of other women navigate similar challenges. Her will divided her considerable fortune among her employees, her protégés, and various charitable causes. The sealed ledger, which had started everything, went to the Massachusetts Historical Society, with instructions that it be preserved as an example of how careful documentation could serve justice. The story of Eleanor Ashford and the blood gold became part of Boston's commercial folklore, told to new generations of merchants as an example of both the dangers of corruption and the power of courage. Her father's name, which Richard Blackwood had tried to erase through theft and fraud, lived on through the ships that bore it, through the business she'd built, through the example she'd set. And every time someone in Boston's merchant community spoke of integrity in business, of fair dealing and honest accounting, Eleanor's name came up, the woman who had demanded her blood gold back and, in doing so, had changed the rules of the game for everyone who came after. The Alpha King had laughed at her once, thinking she was powerless and naive. But she'd had the last laugh, armed with nothing more than her father's meticulous records, her own courage, and an unshakable belief that justice mattered more than convenience. Sometimes, that was all it took to change the world.